Thank you, Gary. So I'll give just a brief intro. First, it's really exciting to see all these people here and to be in the Chester Meeting House because, what was it, 20 years ago, I was here and it was a packed evening and we were talking about the notorious Chester Beavers. Does anyone remember that? And I don't see Pete Zanardi here, but Pete
here.
Is Pete here?
He's here.
Where is Pete? Oh, is he hiding? Oh, geez. I don't want to out him, but Pete was. I used to spend a lot of time at the lunchbox. It was called back then, and that's where I got all the gossip and and one of the stories that Pete told me about was the trapping of the beavers in Chester Creek. And I think as he was leaving, he said, Erik, there are two things you don't want to be in Chester, poor or a beaver. When he said that, I knew I had a great lead. Normally, reporters will ask a source, hey, can I use that? Because he kind of was talking off the record. I have to say, sorry, Pete, I didn't ask him, and I surprised him the next day. But he became, I think, a little more famous than he already is in town. So anyway, I covered Chester for a number of years for the Milltown Press, and then I worked for the Hartford Courant. So I know the river, I love the river. As I say, I'm a reporter, so my approach to Night Boat to New York was very much that of a reporter talking to people. So even though I love history, I really try to highlight the people and the stories of the river. Going back to when the first steamboats ran on the Connecticut River, which was 1815. This is kind of an interesting, there's like one upside to climate change, and that is there's nothing like a drought to reveal what's on the bottom of lakes and riverbeds. And I don't know if any of you were following the drought conditions in Europe, but a number of big rivers like the Danube, the Po, the Adige, I used to live in Verona, went dry. And what was really eerie was that there were some very old shipwrecks that were on the bottom of these lakes, and they all of a sudden came to view, and I always felt like the past haunts the present. It's always kind of finding a way to remind us what it was. And on the Connecticut River, something similar happened. At the mouth of the river, people started seeing these huge timbers off North Cove, huge timbers sticking out of the mud. If they had a, can you still hear me? If they had a tape measure with them and they measured the size of this ship, it would be close to 300 feet long, 276 feet. And I think, we've all gone to Mystic Seaport to visit the Charles W. Morgan, the whale ship. We kind of have an idea of that. But steamboats, the idea that a 300-foot steamboat traveled up the river almost seems improbable. So I, as a reporter and as a historian, was very much kind of attracted to this notion of a world, a vanished world that we don't know all that much about, that we don't talk about, and kind of exploring that. So I have a lot of slides, and I'm going to talk about those, and I hope you enjoy it. So a lot of people ask, where did the boats go? I'm going to start us off in where the point of departure. The boats ran from Hartford to New York, but they were really thought of as New York boats. So you started in New York, and this is where everybody knows the Brooklyn Bridge, right? Well, under the Brooklyn Bridge is Peck Slip, where you left, and this is actually one slip up from Peck Slip. This is where the New Haven boat left. This is a shot from the Brooklyn Bridge at the slips along the East River. And this is probably 1900, so even then you saw a lot of sailing ships. Wouldn't that be great to be able to go to New York and see that today? So you left from New York, but one of the first obstacles you encountered was a place called Hellgate. Do we have any mariners out there who have sailed to New York? When you sail west to New York, you have to pass through this really difficult channel. This is where all the tides from Long Island Sound, where the tide rushes in and out. It's very powerful, and it's called Hellgate. And steamboats kind of arrived a little late to Long Island Sound, 1850, because very few at the time thought it was possible to take a steamboat through Hellgate. And a fellow by the name of Elijah Bunker took this first steamboat through Hellgate, and this is in 1850. So there's Long Island Sound, and this is, so we're going east now. Very interesting, I was able to find the ship's logs from some of the steamboat captains, and at first I didn't know what they meant, this strange notation that you see on the right. And this is what the steamboat captains did. They noted their position everywhere they were, and often kind of an arcane notation of a particular place like Chicken Rocks or Faulkner's Island or something like that. They would put that down first, and then they would put a particular time, 10:06, and that was the time that they passed. And by doing this all along the way, they could always calculate their position, which was important because fog was bad sometimes and you didn't really know. So you could tell exactly where you are at all times, even in pitch darkness and even in a very thick fog. And that system mariners know is called dead reckoning. Now, these were night boats, so you traveled at night. You left in the afternoon, had a marvelous meal, and then you went up on deck and kind of enjoyed the scenery. And this is a painting kind of that gives us something of an idea of what that was like. This is the entrance to the Connecticut River. And one thing about the Connecticut River is you can see here from this nautical map that the Connecticut River is wide, but the channel is very narrow, so it's really difficult for steamboat captains to kind of thread that needle and enter the river. Once you got to Old Saybrook, these were the stops you had along the way. So the first stop was Old Saybrook. The second stop was Essex, then Deep River. I'm sorry, Chester, there was no, if you wanted to get off in Chester, you got off at Deep River. There may have been some local boats, but, and then Hamburg, in Lyme, had Lyme, which is where the Goodspeed Operator's house is, so right across from Chester. And then East Hannah was really an amazing place back then, because East Hannah boasted 2 steamboat landings. Goodspeed's, which was named after William Goodspeed, and the Upper Landing. And each of them had a hotel, and each one had kind of its own attractions. And there's a story that people began drinking at the Upper Landing at a hotel there. And then when they got kicked out, they took the steamboat down to Goodspeed's Landing, Lower Landing, and to finish off the night. So that was East Hannah back then, probably much more lively than it is now. This is a stop, this is Essex. There's a steamboat pulling up to the dock in Essex. So that's what it would have been like. And steamboats, as you can see, traveling by steamboat was almost like a carnival ride in many ways, with all those flags flying. You had kind of the paddle wheels making that wonderful sound. I like that music. What's good? This is Ivoryton, for Deep River, for our Deep River folks. A big, many times you would be seeing ivory unloaded as passengers got off, and those are some of the ivory tusks there. They were used to make piano keys. And I think one of my talks I gave, I quoted William Hills, who was from Chester, who was a steamboat captain, and he said that every ivory tusk, that if you mark the ivory right and cut it right, you could make keyboards for 45 pianos out of one tusk. And I had a friend who's a piano tuner, and he said, Eric, I don't think you're wrong on it. I think you're wrong on it. You know, I don't see how that possibly could be true. And I said, well, you know, I got worried. Maybe I was wrong. You know, that I relied on Captain Hills for this. He did some searching. He searched for a whole week. He talked to this person, talked to that person, and he came back and he said, guess what? 45 piano. You were right. So William Hills, who gave me that information, the old steamboat captain, had that exactly right. So, you know, cutting a tusk was very much like cutting a tree. They marked it very carefully because you didn't want any waste at all. There's Goodspeed Landing. A very unusual shot of a steamboat pulling up to the dock around 1913. And that's Goodspeed Opera House in the background. This is a really lovely painting that's in the Middlesex County Historical Society, and it's a mourning painting on the death of Captain Commodore McDonough, Commodore Thomas McDonough, and that triangular gravestone is his, and so we can kind of see that that was his gravestone, and this is in Middletown Riverside Cemetery. What I thought was really interesting is that two steamboats were in the picture. You can see in the distance kind of the white water churning. One is black and one is white, and one is heading downriver and one is heading upriver. And clearly the artist thought to use the steamboat as this notion of life's passing and where of a voyage, right? Leaving one place and going to another. And I thought that was really interesting because in the 1830s already, they're thinking of the steamboat as something new and modern, and they were clearly wanted to represent that. This is Hartford waterfront. I was up in Hartford, a couple nights ago, passing, with all those, it's like a tarmac. There's so much traffic and there's so much asphalt. This was Hartford in the 1830s. And in the center, you can see the old State House, and with this broad boulevard going down to the water, which was just marvelous. And that was State Street, and the steamboat landing was State Street. It was called the State Street Landing. What's very interesting to note is that State Street is facing the state capitol, the State House is facing the water, because that was considered the most important thing. We'll talk a little bit about, to give you a brief history of steamboats. As I said, mine is kind of an anecdotal history, but I did get a little bit into the origins of steam navigation. To just give you an idea of what the first steamboats looked like, it was a skiff, or like a rowboat, with a little boiler, and I think someone described Fulton's first steamboat. I'll show you that one. That's Robert Fulton's. As a sawmill set on fire and sent down the river. That was how, and there's a story of that the Native Americans ran with fear, and they called it the fire canoe or something like that. I don't think that's really true, but anyway. But cattle got very spooked by the steamboat, and they were very, very loud. Another thing to notice about the early steamboats is that you know, we think of the steamboat as really transportation, but it really, in the early days, it was much more of a very kind of an elegant way to see scenery. And you can see by this representation of Fulton that this was very much an upper class thing. There were orchestras on board, and it's like a beautiful barge. So later they began to be enclosed, but at first it was very much for wealthy travelers to get from one place to another, and it was very expensive. The early steamboats that sailed up the river, and this is not the Connecticut River, but the first steamboat that sailed up the Connecticut River looked very much like this one, which was more or less a sloop, a sailing sloop, with an engine in the center. And they were slow. An early steamboat probably didn't go faster than 5 miles an hour. There's an anecdote that I came across in which a steamboat had left New Haven to go to New York, and on board someone had discovered was someone they suspected as being a thief. He had stolen silverware from a local hotel. He had climbed aboard the steamboat, and he planned to take the steamboat from New Haven to New York to make his getaway. Well, the owner of the hotel discovered the theft, got on his horse, and he beat the steamboat to New York by 20 minutes or something. So that's how slow they were. Another early steamboat, the first ones had sails and they took the sails off, but they still were very much like a whale ship with an engine on it. Gradually, the steamboats got kind of thinner and slimmer, and speed was the thing. So this is kind of the first of the faster steamboats, and this was called the Lexington. And it kind of looks rickety to me, but the story was that the Lexington could move at 25 miles an hour, which is really fast for a boat. Lexington sailed on the Connecticut River too. Lexington's one of the most famous steamboats to sail on the Connecticut River. And that was because of this. In 1840, the Lexington was crossing Long Island Sound in the middle of winter, and the Lexington's principal cargo was cotton. Cotton was taken, bales of cotton, which came from the south, was shipped up to New York, and then it was shipped across Long Island Sound to feed the cotton mills of Boston and Massachusetts. Cotton, 150 bales were stowed aboard the Lexington, and they were packed too close to the stack. And one bale began to smolder, and pretty soon they just erupted. And the flames in minutes were too furious to put out. And so the ship erupted in flames. There were 150 people on board in the middle of winter, in the middle of Long Island Sound. Their only escape was to jump in the freezing cold water, as most did, and nearly all of them drowned. Only out of 150, maybe 4 or 5 people survived. And the two that did, captain and the first mate, were found barely conscious, floating on a cotton bale. That's Cornelius Vanderbilt. Everybody's heard of the Vanderbilt name. He owned the Lexington. An interesting story about Vanderbilt. I came across a painting where Vanderbilt, his arch rival, was a guy by the name of George Law. And Vanderbilt, who could actually pilot a steamboat, he raced George Law on the Hudson River. And George Law, guess what? Even though Vanderbilt's boat was neck and neck most of the way, George Law beat him. Vanderbilt had never been beaten. So Vanderbilt commissioned a painting which showed him winning. So he won, even though he lost. Does that sound familiar? This is another beautiful steamboat about contemporary of the Lexington in 1835, the Bunker Hill, which sailed on the Connecticut River. And this is when steamboats really started to get sleeker and longer and narrower and very elegant. it was also kind of a big deal for a steamboat, for the owners of steamboats to have their boats, just like the owner of a fine racehorse would have their horse memorialized in a painting. Steamboat owners commissioned the best artists at the time to paint a picture. And this is a really lovely painting because it has a kind of folk art quality about it that I really love. Connecticut River steamboats, the big three, really at kind of the apex of the zenith, let's call it, of steamboat on traffic were the 1850s, before the Civil War. And there were three big steamboats: City of Hartford, Granite State, and State of New York. This is the City of Hartford. You'll recognize the Gelston House right there, right? Can you see that? Looks exactly like it does today. This is before the Opera House. But East Haddam, you can really see what a lovely town it was. And that Greek revival palace on the hill there, I think that's William Goodspeed's house. Another steamboat, the Granite State. And then the biggest steamboat to ever sail on the Connecticut River, the State of New York, which was built by William Goodspeed. It was his pride and joy, the flagship of his fleet. It did very well, was very successful, but in 1882, I believe, they were coming downriver, and a little towboat crossed its path, and the captain had to veer off course a bit, just a little bit, but enough to get out of the channel, and he hit a log, a submerged log, which were called snags, and the snag tore a hole in the bottom of the boat, and they started to take on water. They were about a mile upstream from the Opera House. So now the captain really had a decision of where should he beach the steamer, and he chose to beach the steamer opposite Goodspeed's Landing. The only trouble was it was a very high bank, and when he beached the steamboat broke in half. So the repairs were very costly. Nonetheless, he felt that he would save passengers, and there were like 150 passengers on board. Well, William Goodspeed, whose Opera House was opposite, and he talked about micromanager. Everything that happened, he had to direct. He had a balcony built on the back of which was, we call it the back of the Opera House. It was really the front of the Opera House then, facing the water. He had a balcony where he could talk to his steamboat captains as they came. So when the accident happened, Goodspeed ran out on the balcony. He had grabbed a megaphone and he began to yell to the captain he offered them to take all the passengers off the boat and put them up free of charge at his hotel. He didn't want them really to have a bad experience. So he put them up at the hotel. Uncle Tom's Cabin was playing in the Opera House that night. And so he offered a double bill of free ticket to Uncle Tom's Cabin, and then a tour of the wrecked steamer the next day. So that was William Goodspeed. Another unfortunate, beautiful steamboat, the City of Hartford, another famous kind of accident on the Connecticut River. The steamboat crashed into the bridge at Middletown in 1876. Now, steamboat men were really at war with railroads. I think we have some railroad fans here too. But nonetheless, the steamboat really fought any attempt to put a bridge across the Connecticut River. But they finally got their way at Old Saybrook and later Middletown. Well, one night, shortly, this just a few years after the bridge was built, the City of Hartford was heading downriver, and the captain, it seems, mistaken the light on the shore with a light on the bridge, and he couldn't judge the opening, and he missed the opening, and he plowed into the fixed span, which is what happened then. There's a story that a fellow was in the saloon at the time trying to light a cigar,
and he just struck the match at the moment of impact, and he thought someone had played a trick on him and given him an exploding cigar. But anyway, the railroad folks were convinced that it was intentional, and there was a court case where the steamboat went to court, and the judge ruled that both sides had to share in the damage. There was no one who was at fault. But the one positive outcome for everybody that sails or that travels on the river, you'll notice that all bridges now have red navigation lights. And this is from this accident. Bridges, we're talking all around the country. And this is from the accident at Middletown. Granite State had a set, was another beautiful steamer that did very well, lasted for a long time, but it eventually caught fire in 1883 and burned at Goodspeed Landing. And 4 people died, including a bride on her honeymoon who had jumped over the side with her new husband. And they went into the water together. He tried to hold on to her. She slipped from his grasp. Anyway, I found this photograph that just said steamer on the Connecticut River, and I was certain that it was the Granite State, and sure enough, when I was able to compare the hull, because it had a single stack, this is the Granite State after it burned, just off a place called Lord's Island, which is near Chapman's Pond, just south of the airport, you know where the Goodspeed Airport is. So this is where that was. And these are the headlines from that story. 4 lives sacrificed, a last embrace. It became a really big story on the Connecticut River because of the bride and her husband the bride was killed. So we'll talk a little bit about freight. Passengers made money for the steamboats, but probably freight made more money. So that was a big part of steamboat profits. So this is a derrick loading freight onto the steamboats. Everybody's heard of Colt pistols. Colt probably wouldn't have been the success that he was without having the steamboats, the ability to ship guns. So think of that. Crates and crates of pistols and probably bullets were shipped on steamboats. And Chester, which manufactured all sorts of things, as many of you know, lots of tools, various tools. All of Chester's merchandise would have been shipped by probably more steamboats than trains. Now, these are kind of the forgotten heroes of steamboats, and they are the freight handlers, or they were called roustabouts, sometimes rousters. And most of them, certainly in New York, on the Mississippi, but also up here, many of them were African Americans. And it's worth pointing out, and I have a chapter in the book, African Americans really formed the backbone of the labor force for steamboats, just as they did later for trains, the famous Pullman porters. But that tradition really began with steamboats. This is New York. These are the New York docks, and they're using those. But before they're using these dollies really to load freight. But oftentimes they were just carrying shoulders of grain, 100 pound on one arm, 100 pound on the other arm. So I mentioned Goodspeed. This is William Goodspeed here. He's kind of, I talk a lot about him in the book. He was a real steamboat entrepreneur, but he really envisioned the whole new kind of tourism for the Connecticut River, which was to bring New Yorkers up to his opera house and to bring the performers up the river too, and all the sets. Everything came up the river on steamboats, and they put on shows. But he was kind of a P.T. Barnum character. And so anything that he could do to make money at his opera house, he would do. So he brought in a band of Kickapoo Indians, I think they were called. And they danced in full war paint on stage. That was at the opera house. Many orators came in. Also, something called phrenology was really popular then, which was, you would have, and William Colt began doing this. This was also at the Opera House, where there would be a volunteer from the audience, and the phrenologist would feel his skull and tell him whether he was like a villain or a hero or something like that. Goodspeed also brought a 90-foot stuffed whale up the Connecticut River and had it displayed on the lawn, I think, for 25 cents. It was, does anyone hear the story of Barnum? The famous story about Barnum was the sign he put up that said, "This way to the egress," and everybody followed the sign, which of course, this maze, which led them here in the air and eventually just out through the egress. I talked about that balcony. This is Goodspeed Opera House. I just discovered this beautiful model of the Opera House at the East Haddam Historical Society. And if you can believe it, this thing is entirely built out of matchsticks. And it was built by someone in the Haddam jail, by a prisoner. And I'm thinking, well, was this guy serving like 3 consecutive life sentences? How did he have the time to build this? Because the Haddam jail, they were mostly drunks, that spent 3 months at a time. Anyway, there must have been a drunk or something that came back again and again and kept working on his modeling. But you can see on the second floor that balcony with the 2 doors, the French doors open. Behind those French doors was Goodspeed's office. And that's where today is the dressing rooms. That's where the dressing rooms are. So I got a chance to go up there and visit. And I don't know, I think the dressing rooms were there in Goodspeed's day too, because the dressing rooms were right under the stage. Then you climb these very narrow stairs to the stage above. So we can kind of imagine Goodspeed as a real entrepreneur, he's doing his steamboat stuff, but while performers are getting ready for a performance, that kind of thing. So I think that's just marvelous. To get a sense of what East Haddam was in the day, this is a small steamboat called the Mary Benton at the dock, and the ship is being built and launched in the right-hand corner there, with the Gelston House in the back. Another early steamboat called the Oliver Ellsworth, passing East Haddam in the 1830s. This is another find recently, it's not in the book, but to give you a sense of how important East Haddam was as a resort colony. The Hotel Swan, which I believe is the Gelston House. This is a log from them, and you can see people from Hartford, Springfield, New York, and then some local folks to Brooklyn. So people were coming up from all over to stay in East Haddam. I think Boss Tweed, I found, stayed in East Haddam. Boss Tweed had a diamond that he wore in his shirt front that I think was worth today about $3 million. And we know now where all that money came from. It's funny, when I show this slide, I skipped over this slide in my last talk in Guilford, and everybody said, hey, go back to that slide there. Really, the steamboat is responsible for summer travel and the whole summer resort colony. So I have a chapter in the book on this, and that really fascinated me. The idea that until there was really an easy way to get people to the shore, we didn't go to the seashore. And so the steamboat was really responsible for that. On Long Island Sound, a song that was composed, very much part of that whole steamboat culture. There, the picture on the right, yeah, I guess it's on your right too, is Coney Island around the turn of the century. And you can see the ladies' swimming costumes were rather quite cumbersome. And they were woolen. and they wore kind of tights underneath them, but they had to conceal their curves, so they were almost required to wear these heavy dresses over. But you went in the water weighted down with all these wool clothes, and you could drown pretty easily. So they strung these ropes. You can see you would hang onto the rope, and you would go out farther and farther. Another really exciting, kind of interesting part of the book for me was to look into the men that captained the boats. And one of the most famous captains, probably the most famous Connecticut River captain, was George Parmalee, who happened to be from my hometown of Haddam, Connecticut. And his house, up until recently, was still there. And George Parmalee lived to be 102, and he was born in 1824 when Lafayette took an early steamboat down the river, and he was still alive in the 20s, driving his Model T, tooling around his house. And it's funny because I always thought that I knew he missed being a steamboat captain, but in an article about him when he turned 100, he said that probably nothing gave him greater pleasure than driving his Model A, his car. He loved his car. Everywhere Parmalee went, kids followed him and wanted to hear a story about fighting off river pilots or battling fogs or something like that. So this is a wonderful picture of George with his pipe talking to students at a school. This is probably, one of those one-room schoolhouses, because you see they're all ages here, and that was the way people learned. This is a pilot house, not a Connecticut River boat, but perhaps a little bigger. But this will give you a sense of what a steamboat pilot house looked like. And it was pretty good size. And all those pulleys that you see, you've heard the expression with all the bells and whistles. Well, that comes from steamboats, because you pulled those and they rang a bell in the engine room, which communicated various instructions to the engineer to either go faster, full steam ahead, or to slow it, all these things. So you had to communicate. You could steer from the pilot house, but everything was controlled in the engine room. And just to give you a sense of the early days, we just see one fellow there in the pilot house. But in the early days, there would have been 4 or maybe 6 people in the pilot house. The wheel was so hard to turn that they needed wheelsmen, and they needed 4 wheelsmen, 2 on each side, because it was so hard to turn that they needed 1 or 2, they needed at least 2 to kind of really lean into it. An article on George Parmalee, who lived to be 102 when he died. He was called the Ancient Mariner. The last years of steamboats, it's very interesting. I think someone once said that steamboats were like the dinosaurs in that just before extinction, they waxed to their greatest proportions. So steamboats got bigger and bigger and bigger before they disappeared. These are 2 of the biggest, over 400 feet, room for 1,000 passengers comfortably. And these were Long Island Sound boats, too big to get up the Connecticut River. This is the Connecticut River boats didn't have an interior. Were never quite as elegant as this, but this will give you an idea of really how one of the big Long Island boats, of what the interiors looked like. So one very important aspect of steamboat travel was socializing and meeting your friends. We call it the promenade deck, right? And so people would dress up and, excuse me, and it was a place to see new people, but also to be seen. So the steamboats lasted on the Connecticut River. They went from 1850, about 100 years. The last steamboat was 1931. Probably the best known boats were the Middletown and the Hartford. And these were boats that were built in the 1890s and went up to 1931. This is the Middletown on her maiden voyage. And someone brought in paint. We have a painting of the Middletown up there from a, well, who brought that? The a Chester. Oh, hi.
Ralph Herman, my wife's name is Patricia Hills, so her grandfather was Captain William Hills.
And Captain William Hills, it's just really, it's marvelous to even hear that name. Because Captain Hills was another amazing steamboat pilot. And he was kind of like, reporters are always looking for a good source, you know. And Captain Hills, the reporters loved him. So he ended up speaking to the Middletown Press and the Hartford Courant quite a bit. So I relied a lot on Captain Hills and what he said. So he's kind of a character in the book that you'll see again and again. But this was his boat, the Middletown. And Captain Hills, Mark Twain, who lived in Hartford for 20 years, you would think, this is a guy who's going to be talking about steamboats on the Connecticut River. Well, guess what? He snubbed us when it comes to steamboats, because Twain, I could not find any reference to either the Connecticut River or to Connecticut River steamboats. But I did find an article in which Captain Hills of Chester, Captain William Hills, talks about meeting Twain on a trip up the river. And Hills was young then. This is before he was a captain, around 1900. And Twain asked to be awakened at midnight so he could see the moonlight on the water. They did. They fetched him at moonlight. He fetched him at midnight. He came up to the pilot house and smoked his pipe. And then he went out to the deck and he was gazing at the beautiful scenery. And at a certain moment, he dropped his pipe. And the story Hills tells is that he picked up, Twain's pipe and gave it back to him. And Twain reached into his pocket and gave him a silver dollar. So that was that story that Hills would always tell about Mark Twain. The companionship to the Middletown was the Hartford. And the Hartford was actually a little bit older. And they were identical in every way except the Hartford had 2 stacks and the Middletown had 1. This is one of the last voyages of the Hartford heading downriver. And the Connecticut River Museum has this photograph, and it's really just lovely. It's kind of like, it says it all, I think. It's, it shows the beauty of the Connecticut River, but also this kind of sad moment, when the Hartford, was heading downriver, never to return. And his last trip was Halloween, 1931. And I came across an article in which that last trip was described. There were a number of people on it. Many people had come to make a final voyage, and they decorated a table, the captain's table, with Halloween decorations. And people were trying to be upbeat and festive, but there was somewhat of a bittersweet tone to that article of the last trip. And they arrived in New York the next morning. And the story was, and I think, Captain Bacon was the captain of the Hartford, but Captain Hills was the captain of the Middletown, and they had to take the train back to Hartford because there was no way, there was no boat back anymore. So I mentioned the Granite State. This is that remarkable view of the Granite State now. The Granite State's always been underwater, but because of this summer's drought, more and more of the hull started to be exposed, and you can kind of see the timbers, the outline of this ship, and then the timbers in the center. And it would be a marvelous time to, to perhaps do some archaeological research and to see, or archaeological exploration and see if there's any artifacts on board. But that's the Granite State. And I have to say that idea that there's still something here on the river that takes us back to those days is really a wonderful thought, and kind of a little bit of a haunting thought, that that the steamboats in many ways are long gone, but there are here and there are relics, are mementos, from this great age. And so you can take your kayak out to the mouth of the river and see what's left of the Granite State. I'm going to end it there and open it up for questions, because I always like to do a good question and answer session. And since we have the descendant or a relative of Captain Hills, I hope to have him call it. But Blair, great. Do you want to turn up the lights now?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, yeah, good.
I was just going to ask, how much roughly did it cost for them to travel on the steamboat, like in today's money?
That's a good question. And steamboats, it was not that expensive. It was probably the cheapest passage might be as little as 25 cents, and so maybe $1 in today's, $1 or $2. So you had various, if you were wealthy and you could afford a stateroom, that would be more. But if you just wanted to sleep on the deck, you could get there for a couple dollars, really, from Hartford to New York. Great.
When was the channel dredged and the breakwater built?
The breakwater, as far as I can tell, was in the 1880s, where the breakwater was built. And there's a story about the state of New York that you saw. And the state of New York, I guess, was kind of like a bad luck ship. You're never supposed to change the name of a ship. Once you decide on that name, that's it. Well, with the state of New York, it was going to be called like Capital City or something. And they changed it at the last minute to State of New York. And it was plagued by accidents. And one of the accidents, it was coming in to Old Sabre past the breakwater when they were building it, and a big rock got loose, rolled down, and the steamboat ended up hitting it and getting a hole. So 1880s. And then as far as dredging goes, dredging really didn't began a little bit before the steamboat. Didn't really begin until like 1815, 1810 or so. But it's a good question, because the Connecticut River really is a shallow river. It's so shallow that when John Winthrop, who, the founder of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, when the Pilgrims were trying to say, John, let's go settle in the Connecticut River, and Winthrop, this was in 1835 or so, Winthrop said, no, it's there's only 6 feet of water at the mouth of the river, so it's too shallow, and there's also troublesome Indians, so we don't want to settle in the river. So above Middletown, the channel really could be 6 feet at times, and you really need about 12 feet of water for a steamboat to travel, 10, 12 feet. In fact, Mark Twain's name he got his name from Mark Twain, which means 2 fathoms or 12 feet, which is a safe amount of water for a steamboat to travel. So they never wanted to get below Mark Twain. So it was dredged pretty early, and it was dredged continuously, especially from Middletown to Hartford, which is shallower. But today, you wouldn't be able to get any kind of steamboat up from Hartford, because they haven't dredged it in years, and so it's filled in quite a bit.
When the steamboats were in operation, was it quicker or less expensive to go by boat to New York than by railroad?
most people traveled by steamboat, and it was cheaper, and the freight, it was cheaper to travel by water, and it was cheaper to send freight by water. And it was also more of an experience. So many people, if they traveled to New York, went by steamboat. Except, guess who? Mark Twain, the steamboat man. Guess how he got to New York? He lived in Hartford, and there was a train in Hartford from around 1850 or so, 1840, pretty early. So Twain, who really was very much a modern thinker, he wanted to get to New York as fast as possible, so he always took the train. So much for Mark Twain. Anyway, I still like him.
Does any of the boats or part of the boats still exist physically today?
Well, what you saw there, that's it. That's it. Now, there are a few things that do exist. There are, I think, a lantern maybe from aboard, a lamp from aboard the Grand Estate has been found. But nothing really, there are really only 2 steamboats in New England that have existed. One is a Sabino in Mystic, which is from the 1900s. And then there's another steamboat, forget its name now, which is up in New York State, which they brought to a museum, which is a museum in itself. And those are the only 2. Wooden steamboats especially were very short-lived, They were kind of built, they weren't really, the hull was pretty solid, but the rest of the boat was kind of flimsy. So they just didn't last that long. So there really is nothing left, really. No steamboat left.
Where is that? Where is that?
It's at the mouth of what's called North Cove. So North Cove is still pretty good anchorage. In Old Saybrook, yeah.
So the background is Griswold Point?
Yes,
Looking up there.
yeah, so I'm guessing that is looking over to Old Lyme. Yeah, so that's the Old Saybrook side looking over to Old Lyme. And why it ended up there, we think it was towed to that spot to be a breakwater for the entrance of North Cove to prevent silting, to prevent the silting up of the entrance. Any other? The gentleman who brought this, anything you want to say about the painting? This is the Middletown, and I guess it was a gift to Captain Hills, who was from Chester, who died in the 1960s. How long did he live?
No, I think he died before that.
Before that, okay.
But that's an original date, it was from 1915.
Okay.
And his burial place is right over here at Fountain Cemetery.
Is it really?
Really neat monument there, and other family members are there, but a nice big monument saying Captain William Hills.
Oh, he that was the wonderful thing about steamboat travel, is that, these captains were captains for 20 years, so you got to know them, they were part of the community. When I was in Guilford a week ago, I was kind of comparing contemporary travel to steamboat travel, and I think at some point I said, I don't mean to, disparage modern jet age travel, and someone from the audience piped up and said, "Oh no, go ahead. It was, it's positively horrid." So the steamboat was something. Everything about it was made, was designed to make the traveler feel special and to feel pampered, and even if you didn't really have that much money to spend. Really, it was the experience that the owners were after, and making you feel like you were important, that the boats were beautiful. So you experience a kind of luxury, probably more than, steamboats were more luxurious than any house at the time. So it was really, for someone like a working class person, it was the first real luxury that they had been exposed to, and probably electricity, I think, steamboats had electricity even before many houses had electricity. So they were really advanced that way. Oh, Maria?
Erik, will you share that anecdote about the woman that gets up and packs all her stuff, and then you leave Hartford and you wake up how many hours later?
In some of my talks, I've actually read from a woman who lived on the Connecticut River called Louise Brooks, and Louise talked about the experience of getting on the steamboat where all of her, they would travel to Haddam Neck each spring, and pretty much all of their belongings were brought to their summer house in Haddam Neck, and even a horse and a dog and chickens were crated up for the trip. And so that was a marvelous, a really exciting trip for youngsters at the time. And then there was a fellow I met in East Haddam. He's a blacksmith, but he lives next to Helen Keene, I think her name was, and Helen was the wife of William Langdon Keene, who was a marvelous painter in the 20s and 30s. And she was something of a fashionable socialite. So steamboat was considered the way to travel, was very fashionable. But she talked again and again, years later, in the 50s and 60s, about how beautiful the steamboat was. And her refrain was, you go to sleep on the Connecticut River and you wake up in New York. And she just loved that and loved that whole. And I think that, that would be a great way to travel today too.
Yeah, you showed us one picture of the ivory tusks,
Yes.
and they were offloaded in Deep River, and I assumed that you meant that they came up the river on a steamboat.
Correct.
But they had to cross the Atlantic Ocean, from probably Madagascar all the way around to get to the States.
Right.
And that was not on steam power, it was probably a freighter or something.
It would, well, in the early days, it would have been a sailing ship, but for the most part, it would have been a steam, a transatlantic steamer.
So they had to transfer the tusk
Correct.
to a
So-
smaller boat.
So steamboats came, Ivory, Zanzibar was really kind of the ivory center.
Right.
So and there's a hole, that's a hole. Are you from Deep River or are you?
Chester. But
Chester,
but
okay.
I'm interested in.
There's a
the
whole
ivory
story
trade.
there
Yes.
about the ivory trade, and it was a brutal trade
Brutal.
because many slaves were used and they went into the jungle.
White
and-
gold, slavery.
Yes, and so ivory, and we don't really think about that. We just enjoyed the beauty of pianos and parlor pianos and cue balls and things like that. But yes, so the ivory would have been shipped from Africa across the Atlantic to New York, and at New York it would have been offloaded onto a steamboat, onto a local steamboat, and shipped through Long Island Sound and up the river.
Do you have any pictures of those boats with the ivory tusks?
All I have, no, I don't have any. I do have descriptions from Captain Hills talking about how difficult it was, that you needed 2 or 3 men to get the ivory tusks off the boat. But I don't have any, all I have are memories.
That would be a find.
Yeah, that would be. Interestingly, the book is called Night Boat to New York, but there are not hundreds of photographs of Connecticut River steamboats because they operated for the most part at night, so it was hard to get a good picture of them. So we don't have a lot of pictures, very few of the steamboats at the dock and offloading freight, because most of the time that was happening at night. Oh.
The Dennisons from Winthrop, which were plane makers in the mid-1800s, they shipped all their rosewood and ebony and their fine woods were shipped. And in that logbook, it tells about paying for the cartage from Deep River Dock up to Winthrop, where the manufacturing was.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, that's
That's
wonderful.
in the Deep River Historical Society, your logbook.
That's wonderful, yeah.
You know, so I mean, it wasn't just that industry, it was, it was a full-time business carting all the stuff from the Deep River docks up to the different industries, all along the, in Chester, all along the mills that were along the rivers. All that material that they were producing and manufacturing either had to be carted down to the landing in Deep River, or the raw materials carried up from Deep River. So that was a big secondary business.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, I mean, you could do a book on just freight alone and manufacturing, and you can't really say enough, but everything that was made in the Connecticut River Valley, and a lot of things were made just in Chester alone. I mean, pen tips, I think Chester was famous for. Was that Silliman or something like that? Inkwells, okay. And like the first port they were used in the Civil War. So, I mean, all those inkwells would have been shipped by steamboats. One kind of glimpse of how much freight went on a steamboat was the Granite State. And they had to note for insurance purposes all the cargo that was lost so that they could make a claim. But all sorts of things, you know, sugar and flour, so foodstuffs. But then even Captain Hills talked about in the last stage of the steamboat, cars, which were manufactured in Hartford. I think the early automobiles, a few early automobiles, were loaded onto the steamboat, taken downriver, and then someone in New York picked them up and drove them off. No, did you have a question?
Yeah, on that steamboat right there, the Middletown, it doesn't show propulsion either at the side or at the rear. How was that propelled?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. When these steamboats came up the river, one of the first things that people noticed is where are the paddle wheels? Well, these are they're like a modern ship. They're screw propellers. And they were twin screw propellers. So they were, you can't see them because they're underwater. So pretty much it's a modern propulsion system, and it was considered more efficient, safer, you know.
Since the steamboats traveled at night, when did they institute navigational beacons?
Pretty early. So even in the 1850s, really they start to get a system of lights, navigational beacons, and something that were really important called range lights. And if you're, you know, range lights were very important for the pilot. That's actually two little lighthouses, and the pilot, to know where he was in the channel, if it was a really twisting channel, to know that to be sure that he was in the center of the channel, he would align the bow of his ship with a light on shore and then another one in the distance. And if he was on that line, that range light, he knew that he was in safe water. So range lights go back to, gosh, the 1850s, and of course they were oil lamps in the beginning, and they were whale oil, I guess. And there's a story in the book that I have about the lighthouse keeper of South Glastonbury, who went every night to light the lights for the steamboats. And guess what? He was completely blind. Wow. And he knew the river so well that he could scamper down the banks. And there's a story of a reporter trying to follow him, stumbling down the hill while the blind fellow was like finding his way. And he would light the lights, and he was like fake.
And who paid them? Is that the state thing or local thing?
Good question. I mean, lighthouses probably were maybe even federal. You know, they were. I think lighthouses were.
This is the river, not the lighthouses. This is the river. So.
Right, but they were considered, just like today, who takes care of all the navigational stuff? The Coast Guard. You know, so it's considered, you know, national navigation system. So it wasn't local. Joel Severance is kind of the expert on that, so I don't know if he can. But I believe, weren't they
They weren't locally financed or even state. It was probably a national fund.
In the lighthouse service back then.
Yes. Oh, Peter,
Captain Hills,
did I get it most of tonight right?
I guess,
No.
Captain Hills became a legend after that steamboat. Because for several years after that, he was a riverboat pilot.
That's correct. He piloted he piled tugs.
And asphalt up the river.
Yes.
I don't remember this, but I remember people telling the story that when he was off Chester, he would flash the light at his house and blow the horn, and people started waiting for that.
Oh, really? Yeah,
When they heard the horn, they knew it was Captain Hill.
yeah.
But he would flash the light because their house was up on the hill, still there.
I think I heard something like that where
He would flash his.
he'd let us know his wife. I think that was to put the kettle on for his tea, right? So he would, yeah.
We saw it in Chester Lake.
Yeah, that's, there are a number of stories like that about captains and how they knew people and how they had these little traditions. But you're right, Captain Hills piloted oil barges and tugs up the river. And that tradition, really interestingly, continued right up until 2002 or 3. Because if you've ever been down at Old Saybrook, when a tanker came up the river or an oil barge, they would send out a skiff, and aboard the skiff was a pilot. Those folks from New Jersey, most of them were, they didn't know the river. So they needed a local pilot to take them up the river. So they would get on the boat, and they would actually steer the boat up the Connecticut River. And the captain, would be there, but the local pilot was the one that would take the boat upriver.
But Captain Hills was on tugboats too.
Captain Hills was on tugboats, yeah, and because a lot of oil barges were barges, right? And I believe, I think they were for the most part pushed up the river. They may have been pushed up and then towed down or something like that. But I think it was, yeah, it's very difficult because if something happened, you can't stop an oil barge with your brakes. It's going to go, and there are stories of barges, a captain trying to stop the boat, and it ended up going like halfway across Haddam Island or something. No.
One more question about these early boats, the very early boats. You say they're around 1830, somewhere around there, maybe, something like that?
Well, the first steamboat to come up the river is 1815. Yeah.
1815. Okay, that's even earlier. Okay, so for the Connecticut River, you say they're kind of flimsy, but that the hulls were rather sturdy. Did they have anything in the hulls for ice protection?
They did not, for the most part. And that meant that and I neglected to mention this, but for about 2 months every winter, the river closed to steamboat traffic. So the steel hulls were a little better, but pretty much, and that was one disadvantage that allowed trucks to compete with steamboats, because 2 months you couldn't take anything to New York. Yeah, trains for the most part, yeah. But so, yeah, they were not allowed to get through they were not strong enough to make it through the ice. I think we're good. One last thing. Like when you go to see a movie and people always say the book is better. I got books here, so I think maybe you like my talk, but guess what? The book is better. So. Thank you so much.